This presents an interesting and rather challenging issue for the court. Typically, you will not have an instance where a lawyer or an employee of a lawyer is sought to be, for the other side, is sought to be called in as a witness. But we have what we have in this case, where the state is seeking to call this investigator as a witness. So the question for the court becomes whether or not the attorney-client privilege applies. The case that seems to be the leading case in this state on that issue, State v. Hitopoulos, which involved the state calling or attempting to call a psychiatrist as a witness, and the court in that case indicated that the attorney-client privilege extended to experts employed by the defense. That issue also came up again in State v. Thompson, where a conviction was reversed, where a psychiatrist employed to assist with plea negotiations was threatened to be called, and therefore the defense said because the state was going to impeach him with his own psychiatrist, prevented him from testifying. So we start with the whole question here is, one, whether or not the communication we're dealing with is privileged. The communications that we're dealing with are the actions that may be the framework of the testimony was something that occurred in the any room with law enforcement present, with law enforcement conducting the interview after law enforcement administered or gave the Miranda warnings to the defendant. So we do not have privileged communications here. We have communications to law enforcement, and the investigator was present. So then we move to the rules cited by Mr. Savage as to restrictions or professional responsibilities of prosecutors in criminal cases. And as he stated, it says the prosecutor shall not subpoena a lawyer in criminal proceedings to present evidence about a past client unless the prosecutor reasonably believes, one, the information is not protected by any applicable privilege, and I've just concluded that it does not. Two, the evidence sought is essential to the successful completion of an ongoing prosecution. And third, there is no other feasible alternative to obtain the information. As to the second prong of that, the evidence sought is essential to a successful completion of an ongoing prosecution. We have critical credibility questions presented here where the agent testified as to statements given by the defendant that a demonstration was performed by the investigator at the direction of the defendant, that the defendant had an opportunity to make corrections to the notes that the investigators took, and their intentions to reduce it to writing and have the defendant sign it at the end of the day, all of which was interrupted by the word that they received that this video was going to be given to the media, and it forced the law enforcement to act more quickly. All of which apparently creates some challenge for the state to establish the credibility of that testimony without law enforcement having an opportunity to fully complete their work on that day as they anticipated doing. So I find that the state has met the test of establishing that this evidence is essential to the successful completion of this prosecution, at least to present the issue to the jury in the manner in which the state is seeking to do so, and that due to the critical nature of the evidence, there is no other feasible alternative to obtain it, in that they were prevented from obtaining a written statement based on the circumstances that I just outlined. The evidence is not cumulative in that it's, at least I haven't heard the testimony that the indication is that it would not be cumulative, but rather primarily a demonstration, among other things, and not cumulative to the testimony of the officer in the way cumulative testimony is otherwise disallowed, and that the probative value of the testimony outweighs any prejudicial effect on the defense. So though as unusual as this may be, I find that the testimony is nevertheless admissible, that State v. Thompson and State v. Hitopoulos provides some guidance to the court in analyzing this issue based on the laws of this state, and such testimony has been allowed in the federal courts in other cases. So I will allow the testimony of the witness over the objections and exceptions by the defense. Anything else before the jury comes in?
Yes, briefly, Your Honor. The defense mentioned their intention to impeach this witness with a drug conviction that is 7 years old, 2009. We would concede that it meets the initial threshold, Rule 609, and that it carries over 1 year. At least an equivalent here is from an out-of-state conviction, carried in 1 year. But however,
Carried over a year or within a year? Or
it's approximately 7 to 8 years old, but we believe the potential punishment would carry over 1 year.
Okay.
That's the threshold. The next step of the analysis is a 403 under the rule. Is a typical 403, does its probative value outweigh its prejudicial effects? We believe it does not. I think our appellate courts have ruled on more than one occasion that the impeachment value of merely a drug conviction is quite low, and that we think, weighing the distance and time from when this occurred and the low impeachment value, and then it does not go to a drug conviction does not speak to honesty or anything of that crucial nature, that we don't believe it survives the Rule 609 analysis, especially how Rule 609 bootstraps 403 is sort of the second step of that analysis.
Well, under the 609 analysis, the rule is different from the accused as opposed to other witnesses. Under Rule 609A, 1, evidence that a witness other than an accused has been convicted of a crime shall be admitted, subject to 403 if the crime was punishable by imprisonment in excess of 1 year. Though the evidence of conviction of drug offenses, typically possession offenses. Courts of health is not probative on the issue of credibility and typically will not be allowed against an accused. I find that in this case, impeachment with this evidence is not more prejudicial than probative, and I will allow that impeachment. What else?
Thank you, Judge. Just to clarify, you will allow this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Nothing from the state.
All right, let's bring the jury. We'll stand and stretch a little bit as we wait for them to come in. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I understand there was a busy traffic morning here in Charleston today. Most of us were able to get here on time, and we had some matters that we had to address outside of your presence, ready to go now. State may call you next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Levi Miles.
Do you swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court, the jury, and the trial of this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your first and last name and spell your last name loudly and clearly.
Levi Miles, Miles, M-I-L-E-S.
Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Miles, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you? Are you nervous to be here today?
Sure.
I'd like to take a second just sort of introduce you to the jury. How old are you?
39.
And where are you from originally?
I grew up in Conway, South Carolina.
Okay, what brought you to Charleston?
I took a job as an investigator, David Ayler Law Offices.
Okay. Is that where you're employed now?
Yes, sir.
And how long have you worked with Mr. Ayler?
About 6 years now.
And in what capacity? What's your job, you said again?
My title is investigator. It includes sort of a task-oriented job, pretty much what's asked of me that day, whether it's assisting, reviewing the discovery, taking client calls, whatever's asked.
Okay. And what sort of educational background do you have?
Associate's degree from Spartanburg Methodist.
Okay. You said a task-oriented job. Could you sort of expand on that a little more?
I mean, meaning what's out in front of us that day or that week, I'm asked to, either go see a client in the jail, or meaning I'm told what to go do, essentially.
So sometimes those actions aren't very glamorous. Is that something?
Right, it's not the same thing every day is what I mean, yes, sir.
Okay. And were you employed for Mr. Ayler in that capacity in April of 2015?
Yes, sir, I was.
In early April of 2015, did your employer come to represent the defendant, Michael Slager?
Yes, sir, he did.
And in the course of that representation, were you present for a conversation that took place on April 7th, 2015, between Michael Slager and agents of SLED?
Yes, sir, I was.
Okay. As we go forward, I'd just like to sort of let you know, we're just going to be talking about what occurred in that room. Okay?
I understand.
Nothing outside of that, just what took place in front of the SLED agent.
Yes, sir.
About what time of day did this conversation take place?
Somewhere about mid-morning or so,
Okay.
before lunch,
And where did it occur?
at our North Charleston office on Leeds Avenue.
Okay. And that's your employer, Mr. Ayler's office?
Yes, sir, I'm sorry, yes.
Okay. And who all, to your recollection, was present for this conversation?
There were two SLED agents, Officer Slager, myself, and David Ayler.
And do you recall the identities of those two SLED?
I can't think of their names right now, I'm sorry.
Okay. Now, did you take detailed notes during this interview?
No, sir, I didn't take any notes.
Okay. Was that you said you have sort of a task-oriented job, was that job assigned to you that day?
No, sir, it was not.
Okay. Did you notice at any course during the time during the interview, anyone else was taking notes at this interview?
Yes, sir, I believe the SLED agents were taking notes.
Okay. Let me ask you this, in all of the time, and this was April 7th, 2015, correct?
Yes,
In
sir.
all of the time since April 7th, 2015, have you been given the opportunity to review the SLED agent's reports of that interview?
Yes, sir, I've read the report.
And having been present for that interview, did you find the SLED agent's reports, recollections of that interview to be?
Yeah, let me hear the complete question.
What was your opinion as to the accuracy of their reports, having been present during that interview?
It seemed pretty much,
I'm sorry, hold on.
No, you asked a different question. You asked a different question.
I rephrased it slightly, but my question would be, having given the opportunity to review these reports, what was your, and been present for this interview, what was your opinion of the accuracy of this report? May he answer?
Yeah, you asked, there's,
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought there was a pending objection.
it seemed like I remembered it. Nothing really stood out one way or another, different.
Any glaring omissions or things left out of those reports that you recall?
Not that I recall, no, sir.
Okay. Did this interview with Michael Slager, between the SLED agents and Michael Slager, ever get unnecessarily aggressive? What was the tone of the interview?
I mean, I'd say it was serious.
Certainly.
I wouldn't call it aggressive.
Do you ever recall them yelling or screaming at Mr. Slager?
I don't recall that, no, sir.
Okay. Or any other manner were they being unreasonably aggressive towards him?
No, sir, not in my opinion.
Now, did there come a point in this interview where you sort of played a more active role in the interview?
Yes, sir, I was asked to do a reenactment, or play the role of Mr. Scott in a reenactment.
Okay, now, in this, what I guess we'll refer to as a reenactment, you said you were playing what role?
The role of Mr. Scott,
Now, you weren't present for the incident, right?
no, sir.
So who was guiding you in playing the role of Mr. Scott? Who was telling you where to be your positioning?
Officer Slager,
Okay, at any point did agents of SLED try to interfere and tell you how to move or where to go?
no, sir.
Okay. And do you have at what point during the events did this reenactment begin?
I began face down on the ground, I guess after the foot pursuit.
Okay. That's where you started this reenactment?
That's where I started, yes, sir.
Okay. I'd like to ask you if you could to step down from the witness stand, if that's okay? Is that okay, Your Honor? Now again, who were you asked to play, so to speak, in this reenactment? Okay. And if you could, how did you begin reenacting this? Yes, you. And yeah, she needs to take down, and the jury needs to hear what you say. You just speak up just a little bit.
Okay, I started, I guess, face down in the prone position.
Yes, yeah, you could. Yeah, if I could ask you, I'm sorry, I know this is kind of awkward. I'm going to actually slide back a little bit so the jury can see it more towards me. Okay. Is this how you began the reenactment?
This is how it began.
Okay. And what was Michael Slager doing, if you could describe that and use me to the best of your recollection?
He was, like in a side mount, sort of kneel down, trying to hold me down.
Kneel down?
Yeah, he kneel down on your side like that, your arm on me, and so.
Is this?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And how do you describe the events transpiring?
As I was on the back, I was told to keep trying to get up,
Okay.
and at some point, moments later, I was able to roll over on my back, at which point we're sort of face to face.
Okay.
And I grabbed what would fit the taser,
Okay.
and we sort of from this position are kind of going back and forth, wrestling for the taser.
Okay. Do you recall Mr. Slager ever describing a tase at this point that he gave to Mr. Scott?
I don't recall that.
And what occurs here?
At some point, we both end up standing up to our feet,
Okay.
so like this, and then I now have full possession of the taser.
Do you recall him describing Mr. Scott with full possession?
That's what I was told.
Okay. And how did?
At this point, when the taser's raised, I'm stepping forward towards him,
Forward towards Mr. Slager?
towards Officer Slager.
Okay.
To which point Officer Slager steps back and away,
Okay.
draws his firearm, and starts shooting.
Okay. And now, do you recall which way, away, to the right or left? It's okay.
I just remember back and to the side, I mean, just away from him.
And at that point, Officer Slager draws and begins shooting?
Yes, sir.
When, again, in what direction is Mr. Scott moving when he draws and begins shooting?
I was towards him.
Okay. You get to turn the whip. And again, these directions of you were led by whom?
Officer Slager.
And in this reenactment you participated in, the shooting happened, in what direction was Scott moving?
At the point the shots were fired, I was moving towards him.
Okay. And the two were in close proximity in this reenactment that you were doing?
Yes, sir. I mean, we were in a room together, but it was, yes.
Okay. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but at any time in this sequence of events directed by Mr. Slager, were you as Scott directed on top of Mr. Slager?
No, sir. I was never on top.
At any time did Mr. Slager have you act out a punch from Mr. Scott?
I don't recall punching him at all.
A kick
No, sir.
or a bite?
I did not. No, sir.
At any time did Mr. Slager, aside from coming towards him as he reenacted, did Mr. Slager demonstrate that Scott actually tased him?
No, sir.
And the two were in close proximity in the reenactment when the shots were fired?
Can you close proximity, meaning just outside of a few feet of arm's reach is what if that's what you want to call close proximity, yes, sir.
Okay. Approximately, as best you can relax, how long did this interview last?
I mean, I think it was more than an hour, but not too much longer maybe. I don't remember exactly.
Okay. And when the interview ended, did the SLED agents leave?
Yes, sir, they did.
Was Michael Slager arrested at that time?
No, sir.
Okay. Was a second interview conducted that day?
Yes, sir.
And to the best you can recall, about what time did the second interview occur?
Maybe a few hours later, I don't remember exactly.
Okay, was this at the same location?
Yes, sir, it was.
At the second interview that day, was a video of the event shown?
Correct.
Do you recall what your reaction was to seeing that video in comparison to what you had reenacted earlier on?
The objection is sustained.
From the point the two men were on their feet as you acted,
Yes, sir.
did the video comport with the events that you were asked to act out earlier?
No, sir, that part of it seemed to be a lot different.
Court's indulgence. Mr. Miles, please answer any questions Mr. Savage asked. What do you think?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Morning, Mr. Miles.
Good morning.
I understand that you took a job here in Charleston just after you were convicted in federal court in Virginia, is that correct?
No, sir, it was state court.
For distribution of drugs?
Yes, sir.
And that's when you came to Charleston to work for...
About a year later. Yes, sir, about a year later.
And what training did you have at that point other than your involvement in criminal activity to be a criminal investigator?
I didn't have any, no professional training.
Now, this interview that you've reenacted this morning for the jury, how many days after the incident involving Mr. Scott did that take place?
I guess it was done about 3 or 4 days later.
And in that 3 or 4 days, what investigation did you do regarding the incident that occurred?
I wasn't tasked to do any investigation on that, sir.
And what investigation did anyone else in your office do in terms of talking to the medical examiner, the pathologist, the police, North Charleston, SLED, anybody before this interview you have demonstrated to the jury this morning?
I don't know. I can only speak what I was asked to do.
Would you tell the jury exactly what's in your case file?
I'm sorry?
Would you tell the jury exactly what's in your case file on this matter involving Mr. Scott and Mr. Slager?
I don't have a case file for myself personally. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Right, I didn't take any notes. I don't have a file for him.
Well, what documents did you obtain that are in the case file?
I don't think we had any.
And it didn't even sign an agreement with Mr. Slager about representation, isn't that correct?
I'm not sure if we did or not, sir.
But you are sure, because you've been asked this question before. There is no file that you have, or
Right.
Mr. Ayler has, in this case, none.
That's correct.
You did nothing in this case to represent Mr. Slager. Isn't that correct?
I did what I was asked to do.
All you've done has been a pawn with your felony conviction to the state of South Carolina on this reenactment.
Objection, Your Honor. Argument.
The objection is sustained.
When did you first tell the prosecutor about the reenactment?
I don't recall, sir.
Was it within a year of when it took place?
I honestly don't recall, sir.
It wasn't. It was just this past summer, correct?
That very well could be, I don't remember exactly.
And your reenactment for the jury today, you went over that with Ms. Wilson and this crowd over here, right?
That's correct.
And when Mr. Slager's attorneys found out about it and we asked you about it, he said, I can't remember. I don't remember what happened. I can't recall.
I don't remember saying that at all.
You remember denying that you recalled anything about that interview? You know these two investigators sitting right here in the front row?
Yes, sir.
You remember them interviewing you?
I do.
And you remember telling them, I can't remember anything?
No, I don't remember saying anything. I remember remembering parts of it and parts of it I didn't remember.
But you remember what took place on April 7th of 2015?
I remember parts of it, and I remember some I don't.
Now, you do remember Officer Slager saying to you and to Mr. Ayler and to the officers involved that,
Objection, Your Honor. Here's the
Response?
you do remember what Mr. Slager said, correct?
At what point, sir?
At any point during the interview.
There are things that I remember and things that I don't. I'm happy to answer a direct question about it.
Do you remember him saying that his taser was taken away from him?
Yes, sir.
Do you remember what video you saw that day?
I remember that. Yes, sir.
Do you remember that you did not see any portion of the video except for when they stood up and the shooting took place?
Yes, sir. That's accurate.
Do you remember that you didn't see the video which shows Mr. Slager getting pounded on by Mr. Scott?
I didn't see that in the video.
You did see it, though, when I came to your office, didn't you? The FBI enhanced video.
You want to answer the last question?
I don't remember if we watched the video when you came there, Mr. Savage. I remember us meeting there. I can't remember the video.
That was just in September.
I understand. I just don't, the video, I'm answering you honestly, I just don't remember the video part.
Do you ever remember seeing a copy of the FBI enhanced video of the fight that took place before the shooting?
I don't remember that.
Do you remember seeing the position of Mr. Slager, Mr. Scott, in the FBI enhanced video?
No, sir.
Did the state of South Carolina, the prosecutor's office, show you that portion of the video that shows the fight?
We watched the fight video, but nothing stood out different than the first time I saw it.
Did you see it, stills of that video?
I don't remember seeing stills of the video.
Do you remember seeing anybody in a green shirt?
Is in the video?
In the video or the stills of the fight itself?
I don't particularly remember green. No, sir. I mean, I don't remember that part.
Do you know what clothes Mr. Slager was wearing that day?
I don't recall exactly what he was wearing that
Do
day.
you remember what color clothes Mr. Scott was wearing that day?
Let me back up. I know Officer Slager had on a uniform. I don't recall what Mr. Scott was wearing as far as the colors and all that.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Miles, Mr. Savage asked you about a mistake you made as a young man, is that correct?
My first and only arrest, yes, sir.
And that was approximately 7-8 years ago?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Was part of your motivation to move in, maybe a change of scenery, getting away from that?
I've been working hard to get past that part of my life for a long time.
Successfully, I might add, is that correct?
Yes, thankfully, yes.
Okay. Do you think that makes you a bad person
No, sir.
or dishonest?
No, sir.
Okay, well, I'll move on. We won't get to that. This interview did happen some time ago.
Yes, sir.
There are parts you don't recall. Do you recall Officer Slager having you as Mr. Scott move towards him, two-handed taser?
I do.
And is that the point in time where Mr. Slager described having to pull his weapon and shoot.
Don't lead the witness.
At what point in time, what were the actions you acted out of Mr. Scott at the point in time Officer Slager had decided to pull and shoot?
I was coming towards him at the time he decided to pull and shoot.
Mr. Savage referenced video and evidence and enhancements and things of that nature, right?
Yes, sir.
You've viewed some video of this case, right?
I have, yes, sir.
And any characterization of that video, the jury's going to see that.
Objection, Your Honor.
The
I withdraw the question. Thank you, Mr. Miles, on this difficult being here. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Anything further?
You have a chance to study the video?
No, sir.
You have a chance to study
Well,
the video in terms of time, from the time that the two parties were touching each other until the time of the first shot?
I've not done that, no, sir.
Thank you.
You may step down. Your next witness.
Okay, we'll call Angela Peterson.
You swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court and the jury in the trial of this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please state your first and last name and spell your last name loud and clearly.
Angela Peterson, Peterson.
Good morning, Ms. Peterson.
Good morning.
Could you tell our jury where you're employed?
South Carolina Law Enforcement Division,
And how long have you been with SLED?
approximately 2 years.
And did you have any previous law enforcement experience before going with SLED?
I did. I was previously employed with Mount Pleasant Police Department.
What did you do at Mount Pleasant Police Department?
I worked in several different capacities to include patrol. I was assigned to the Terrorism Task Force, also known as Seahawk. I also worked at the Drug Enforcement Administration Task Force and was also a school resource officer.
And what do you do at SLED? What's your?
I'm an investigator.
And what office do you work out of?
The Low Country Regional Office,
Where is that located?
Walterboro, South Carolina.
And does that office service the Charleston County area?
Yes, sir.
When did you become involved in this particular case?
The date of the incident on the 4th of April, 2015, I was on call, and I was contacted by actually both my lieutenant and Captain Ryan Neal in reference to responding to the incident.
Okay, and who is Captain Neal?
He's a captain in our office, Low Country office.
And is he your supervisor?
He is.
What did you do based upon the phone call you got from Captain Neal,
I responded to the incident location.
which is?
It's the area of Remount and Craig Street. There's a vacant lot behind Megapon, so it encompassed the parking lot of Advance Auto, Craig Street, and the empty lot.
And what was your role in this case?
I was assigned as the case agent
And when was that assignment made to you?
while we were on scene.
By whom?
Captain Ryan Neal.
And what are the responsibilities of the case agent?
In conjunction with the supervisors on scene, we will help instruct the investigation, try to obtain the facts of what happened,
How about with regard to the paperwork?
manage paperwork in conjunction with all that.
And were you relatively new to receive a case of this magnitude?
Yes,
Have you ever even testified in a jury trial before?
I have not.
Were you the only SLED agent that responded to this shooting scene?
No, sir. Captain Ryan Neal responded, and also Special Agent Katie McAllister and Special Agent Richard Johnson also responded.
And did you receive a briefing as to what had occurred?
I did a very general briefing.
And from whom?
I believe I got some information from Charles Gant, Lieutenant, and also from Captain Ryan Neal. I believe I got a call from our operations desk that day as well.
And what did you learn as a result of, or what were you briefed? What briefing did you receive as to what had occurred at that location?
That a North Charleston officer, Mr. Slager, had conducted a traffic stop, that the driver of the vehicle fled from the vehicle, and that Mr. Slager gave chase. They ended up in a struggle. He attempted to,
Where did
I'm
the
sorry.
stop take place?
Mr. Slager was traveling westbound on Remount,
We'll get into details, but just where? What location?
the Advance Autos
Okay.
off of Remount Road.
And Mr. Scott had fled from that location?
Correct.
Okay. And continue, just brief, basically what you learned in your briefing.
Just that he had fled from that location, and Officer Slager gave chase. As they rounded the corner into the lot, Officer Slager shouted, "Taser, taser, taser," asking him to stop, and attempted to get him to stop. And the deployment of the taser was unsuccessful. They ended up in a struggle. Basically just that Mr. Scott had gotten Mr. Slager's taser.
And what did Officer Slager do when he'd gotten his taser?
Shot Mr. Scott.
Was Officer Slager still on the scene at the time that you arrived there?
He was.
Do you recall what time it was when you got there?
I don't know the exact time. I believe it was maybe 10:20, 10:30.
Okay. And were you able to speak with Officer Slager that morning?
I was. I believe he was in the vehicle of Mr. Bowman, and he advised, I explained to him who I was and that I'd be conducting the investigation. He advised that he had spoke to PBA, which is...
Yes, sir. Basis for the objection. Yes, sir. Restate the question, please.
As a result of your conversation with Mr. Ayler, did you learn that he had an attorney?
I did.
And who was that attorney?
David Ayler.
And were you provided with Mr. Ayler's telephone number?
Yes.
And as a result of that, you told Officer Slager that you would contact his attorney, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, as part of the investigation which occurred on the shootings, at the shooting scene on April 4th, of 2015, did SLED canvass the area around where the shooting occurred for potential witnesses?
We did.
What is located around this area?
There's several businesses. There's a Gerald's Tires, a diner, a laundromat,
Pawn shop?
pawn shop, Hispanic store.
And what were the results of the canvass?
We were unable to locate any witnesses that could provide us information regarding what occurred as far as seeing the incident.
The actual shooting part of the incident?
Correct.
Who processed the shooting scene for SLED?
SLED crime scene agents Jamie Johnson and Al Brown.
And was that crime scene processed under your direction?
It was not. Captain Ryan Neal was more at the scene handling that part while I was trying to locate witnesses and locate any video that may have been available.
Okay. Moving ahead to the next day, Monday, April the 6th, did you have an opportunity to contact Attorney David Ayler to arrange an interview with Officer Slager?
I did,
And how did you contact him?
by phone,
And do you recall when you contacted him?
I think sometime around 7 o'clock
In the morning or in the
evening.
And were you able to arrange a meeting with Officer Slager and Mr. Ayler?
Yes, sir. We had a meeting set for the next day at 11 o'clock.
And that would be Tuesday, April the 7th, is that correct?
Correct.
And where was this meeting to take place?
At his attorney's office, David Ayler's office off of Leeds Avenue.
Sometime after arranging this meeting, how did you learn of the existence of a video in this case?
We were contacted, Captain Ryan Neal called and let us know.
Called and let who know?
Called and let me know that there was video.
And based upon what Captain Neal told you, where did you go?
I went to the Scott family's house, one of the brothers, over in West Ashley.
You and who?
Myself and Agent Chris Barfield.
And do you recall what time this was Monday evening?
Approximately 10:30, 11 o'clock.
And PM, correct?
Yes.
As opposed to AM. Do you recall which brother's house it was that you went to? I'll take that as a no.
I do not.
When you got to that location, were you able to actually watch the video?
I was.
On what?
A laptop computer.
And it was your understanding that these videos had been downloaded from Mr. Santana's phone?
Correct.
How many videos were there?
There were 2.
And were you provided with a copy of those videos?
I was on a Lexar thumb drive.
By whom?
Attorney representing the Scott family, Justin Bamberg.
Did you have any concerns upon observing the video in this case?
I did.
Why?
Did not show the taser being taken, the shell casings in relation to where the body was, the fact that Mr. Scott was running away.
Did it match what you had been told had happened at the scene?
It did not.
Okay, let's move on to April the 7th. This will be a Tuesday, correct?
Yes.
Did you have an occasion to meet with Officer Slager and his attorney as previously arranged?
I did.
And who accompanied you on this occasion?
Lieutenant Charles Gant.
And were there any discussions between you and Lieutenant Gant regarding this video?
There were.
What were the nature of those discussions?
That we wanted to talk to him and give him an opportunity to tell us what happened before we showed him the video.
And is that standard practice in your profession?
Can you be more clear on that question?
Well, in terms of when you're interviewing a potential suspect, do you let them know what evidence you have against them before you interview?
No.
Why not?
It'd be pretty difficult to get our job done.
Now, who all was present for this interview?
Myself, Lieutenant Gant, Investigator Levi Miles, Attorney David Ayler, and Michael Slager.
And where at Mr. Ayler's office did y'all meet?
In the conference room.
And was Mr. Slager in custody at that time?
He was not.
And I believe we had learned from Lieutenant Gant that meeting was not videotaped, correct?
Correct.
What happened after y'all first met with Mr. Slager?
Lieutenant Gant asked him if he would consent to a buccal swab for DNA, and he consented and provided him a form that Mr. Slager signed, and then Lieutenant Gant got a sample.
Okay. And what happened after Lieutenant Gant had obtained the buccal swab?
Lieutenant Gant then advised Mr. Slager of his Miranda rights.
And did he use anything to advise Mr. Slager of his rights?
Yes, sir, a SLED advisement of rights form.
And you were present when Mr. Slager was advised of his rights?
I was.
Did he appear to understand his rights?
He did.
Did he exhibit any confusion?
No.
Was there anything about his behavior that indicated to you he did not understand what he was doing?
No.
And I believe he had been a police officer for some 5 years, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And presumably would have been aware of Miranda? After being advised of his rights, did he waive his rights and agree to speak with you and Lieutenant Gant?
He did.
During this process, did you and Lieutenant Gant promise him anything?
No.
Offer him anything?
No.
Indicate leniency? He would give leniency if he talked to you?
No.
Threaten him or coerce him in any way?
No.
Pressure him to speak with you?
We did not.
Who took the lead in the interview?
I did.
And if you would, how did you go about conducting the interview?
I asked Mr. Slager if he would try to tell us what happened in narrative form, kind of from beginning to end, like a movie, and to try to be as detailed as possible.
And during this process, did you take notes?
Yes, I did.
And did the notes you take, were they taken contemporaneously with the interview of Mr. Slager?
Yes, they were.
Mr.
Peterson, I hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 205 for identification and ask if you recognize that document.
I do. These are my notes from the interview.
And those are your notes of the interview from April the 7th of 2015, is that correct?
Correct, of Michael Slager.
And how many pages are contained in State's Exhibit 205?
$14.
And were you the only one taking notes during this time?
No, Lieutenant Gant was as well.
And do your handwritten notes accurately reflect what Officer Slager told you on that occasion?
Yes, sir.
And if you would, let's go through your notes. When did you start the interview?
At approximately 11:13.
And what did Officer Slager tell you about how long he had been there and who his supervisors were and all that stuff?
How long he had been,
With North Charleston Police Department.
he said that he had been there for approximately 5 years, and that Sergeant Ronald Webb is his normal supervisor, but that Sergeant Gann was his supervisor for that day. He was working central days on Team 1.
Okay. And what did he say about a traffic stop?
He said that he was traveling westbound on Remount Road, and he observed a gray and color Mercedes with a center brake light out.
And what did he do?
He initiated a traffic stop. He called it out on the radio and initiated the stop. He activated his blue lights and siren using the number 3 button. The vehicle then merged into the middle lane and turned into the Advance Auto parking lot, went right and pulled perpendicular into a parking space right facing Craig Street.
Okay. And what did he say he did after the vehicle came to a stop in the parking lot of Advance Auto?
He got out and approached the vehicle. When he approached the vehicle, he made contact with the driver, who's identified as Mr. Scott. He asked him for his driver's license, registration, and insurance card, and then they had a conversation about Mr. Scott just purchasing the car and not having those items. Mr.
Okay.
Scott did provide him with his driver's license.
What did he say about there being a passenger in the vehicle?
He said that he didn't notice the passenger until he walked up to the car, and at first glance he thought the passenger was a woman, and the passenger wasn't doing anything.
What was the driver doing?
He was going through his pockets, and he kept going to his pockets.
And what did Officer Slager do when he was told that he didn't have the registration and insurance card because he just bought the car?
I believe he said that, let's start with the license, and he took the license from him, tucked it into his duty belt that he said that he regularly does, walked back to his car, got in the vehicle. He was going to run the license, but at some point, Mr. Scott opened the door to the Mercedes and got out.
Before we get there, after he got his license, what did Officer Slager tell Mr. Scott regarding insurance?
That if he bought the vehicle, he needed to have insurance for the car.
And what did he say then, or Mr. Scott say to him?
Mr. Scott then said that he hadn't, I believe he said that, can I look at my notes to refresh?
If it'll refresh your recollection, yes.
He said, if you just bought the car, you need to have insurance. And then he said Mr. Scott changed his story and said he was going to buy the car Monday and that his friend was letting him buy it.
Okay. Okay, and continue, after that, he returned to his car, you said?
He returned to his car. He was going to run NCIC on his own. He said that he hadn't pulled the driver's license out yet and that he looked up and the driver's side door opened. Mr. Scott got out of the car. Mr. Slager then instructed Mr. Scott back into the car. Mr. Scott waved his hands in some type of motion and then did get back in the car and shut the door.
What did Officer Slager say, if anything, regarding why he may have been suspicious of Mr. Scott?
Because of his changing of the story about the car
Did he,
and the purchase of it.
did he mention anything about seeing drugs or smelling drugs or anything of that nature?
I believe Lieutenant Gant asked him if he smelled any marijuana or anything, and he said no, he did not.
Okay, so he's back, and did he indicate that he was able to run an NCIC or driver's license check on Mr. Scott?
He was not. Just as he got ready to do that, to initiate that, Mr. Scott opened the car door again and ran from the vehicle towards Craig Street.
And this was after he tried to get out once and was told to get back into the car?
Correct.
Okay. And where did he say Mr. Scott ran?
Down to the left, down Craig Street, towards the empty lot behind Megapon.
And what did Officer Slager say that he did?
He said it took him a minute to figure out what was going on, and he then jumped out of the car, shut his door, and he got on his radio and advised 223 dispatch, his call number, that he was going to be 1080 down Craig Street, which 1080 is basically giving chase.
Did he say why he gave chase?
He said that, again, I'm going to have to refresh. I want to be accurate with what he said. He said that he ran after the subject because he hadn't removed the license and that his story changed and he didn't know who the guy was and that the vehicle could have been stolen.
Okay, so what happened after he started chasing Mr. Scott?
He said that he ran behind him. They came to the yellow road on the right side of Craig Road. And at that point, Mr. Scott turned right on the yellow road. Mr. Slager said that he pulled his taser out, and as they turned the curve, Mr. Slager yelled, "Taser, taser, taser." He estimated that he was approximately 15 to 20 feet behind Mr. Scott. He said that Mr. Scott started to use his right arm swatting behind himself as if to attempt to swat away the taser prongs to prevent them from making contact.
Is that what Officer Slager told you?
That's what he explained to us. He said that he has heard of other officers talking about suspects doing that in the past and explained to us that he has known suspects to do that.
Okay. And did he explain why he yelled taser, taser, taser?
That was what he was trained to do.
And did he indicate how long he had been certified in the taser?
I believe it was 5 years.
Did he recall, did Officer Slager say anything about what Mr. Scott had in his hands at the time?
I believe we got to that. At one point, he did say that he thought that Mr. Scott had a phone in his hand.
And when he said he saw the phone in his hand, did he indicate that he hadn't seen that phone previously in the car as well?
Previously in the cubby area of the car, below the dash, and said that he had noticed that the screen was lit.
Okay, and what did he say he did when he was behind Mr. Scott and Mr. Scott was waving his arm behind him?
He said that he knew not to try to tase him because he didn't think it would be effective. He said that once Scott looked forward and returned into a running position, he pulled the trigger on the taser. He said that both of the prongs left the taser and one went into Scott's upper left back. The other one did not make contact, therefore not completing the charge.
How did he know that it had not made contact?
He said that he could hear the taser making the click, 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 the electricity noise, and he didn't know where the other prong went, and from those two things he knew the connection was not formed and that the taser wasn't working because one probe didn't make contact with the subject.
Okay, and so what did he do when they said he did after this first taser deployment did not appear to be effective?
He said that Mr. Scott was still running and he was yelling at him to stop. He said that he then switched cartridges. He took one cartridge from the top of the taser that he already expelled. He released it and it landed somewhere on the ground, and then he grabbed the other cartridge, the second cartridge from the bottom of the taser where it's held, and reloaded it to the top.
And the spares are kind of stored in the butt of the taser, is that correct?
A spare, correct.
Okay. Did he indicate how many cartridges he had that day?
He said that he had two, that he may have had one in his glove box, but that he only had two on his person.
Okay, and if you would, continue on. What did he say happened after he had expelled the first cartridge and loaded the second cartridge?
He estimated the first deployment to be at approximately, and I'm just going in order of the notes here, but he estimated the first deployment to be at approximately 14 to 15 feet, and the second deployment to be approximately 8 to 10 feet. And he also clarified that the cartridges, the wires, have a capacity to go 25 feet. At that point, he said he sometimes my writing is not that easy to read, I apologize. He said at that point he deployed the taser again, and at that time both prongs made contact with the subject. He said that Mr. Scott locked up and fell forward, straight down in front of his body.
And where did he say he fell?
On the yellow path.
And where was Officer Slager at the time?
He said that he was still running behind Mr. Scott with his arm extended. He said that he was winded and he felt his adrenaline coming down. He described himself to be tired.
And what did he observe hit the road when Mr. Scott hit the road?
He said that as Mr. Scott fell, he saw a black phone fall as well into the path. And at that point, he heard a voice saying, "Stop, do what the officer says."
And what did he indicate he thought that voice was initially?
He said that he hoped that it was another officer, that he hoped to God that it was another officer and who was there to help him.
And what did he realize it was?
He realized it was a phone on the ground and that there was a voice coming from the phone saying, "Stop, So somebody on the other end of the phone was making the
Did he indicate how
comments.
many times he heard this other person saying stop?
He said approximately 2 to 3 times.
Okay. Now, at the point that he indicated that Mr. Scott locked up and went to the ground, were there any demonstrations done at this point?
Around that time, Investigator Levi Miles was utilized to help with demonstrations.
And he was being directed by whom?
Mr. Slager.
And what were you and Lieutenant Gint doing while this was being demonstrated to you?
Taking notes and observing.
Okay, and what did he say occurred after Mr. Scott had gone down?
He said at that point he was standing next to him to his right side near his knee and hip area. He described Mr. Scott to be on the ground. He said that he was yelling for him to put his hands behind his back and for him to stop. He said that Mr. Scott then moved his hands to a push-up position, and Mr. Slager knew that the 5-second burst was over because he had explained that the taser goes in 5-second bursts. He said that Mr. Scott then brought his knees up and he attempted to raise his body on all fours. Mr. Slager said that he had his taser in his right hand and he utilized his left hand and Mr. Scott's upper mid-back between his shoulder blades to push him down. He said that he was winded, tired, and had been running. He described himself not to be a real strong guy. That's Mr. Slager, described himself not to be a real strong guy. He said that Mr. Scott was yelling something into the phone, and he heard it to be something like, "I'm running down Remount Road," as if to call out a location.
Okay, and what did you say happened as he was trying to put Mr. Scott's hands behind his back?
At that point, Mr. Slager told him to put his hands behind his back, and he grabbed Mr. Scott's left hand by the wrist with his left hand, attempting to secure him. He attempted to get his hand behind his back, but he was unable to do so. He said that as he was moving his left hand from his back, Mr. Scott started to come back up, and that he raised his hips and rolled to his left on his back.
Okay.
Mr. Slager said he used his left hand pushing down in Mr. Scott's upper chest area below his neck to keep him down, and at that point both of them were wiggling and Mr. Scott was trying to get away. Mr. Slager said that he still had his taser in his right hand.
He was using his left forearm to do what?
To push down over Mr. Scott's sternum area. He said that his elbow was near his belly button area.
And Mr. Scott was doing what?
At that point, he was waving his arms around. He put his right arm on the ground. He was wiggling and trying to get away. He pushed Mr. Slager with his left hand in his chest shoulder area to get him off of him. When he was on his back, he realized he still had, when Mr. Scott was on his back, Mr. Slager realized that he still had his taser in his hand.
What did he say about he believed the effectiveness of the taser being at that point?
He didn't think that it would be effective because he thought the wires broke during the scuffle while they were rolling around. He said that he didn't think that the taser would be effective if he used it.
So what did he say he did?
He said that he continued to hold him down with his left arm, and then he brought his right arm in to remove the cartridge. He said that he brought his right arm up to his left side ribs, to Mr. Scott's left side of his ribs and drive stunned him.
After removing the second cartridge?
Correct.
And how many times did he indicate that he'd used the taser during this entire incident?
3 times.
And those 3 times were when?
The first deployment that wasn't effective, the second deployment that was effective, and the third, which was a drive stun.
And what did he say he did after he drive stunned Mr. Scott?
He said he removed his left hand and he grabbed his radio and he asked 156, who was Officer Habersham, to step it up.
Did he say why he took that opportunity to radio in?
I don't recall that or see that. He said, he said that he knew that Mr. Scott was going to be out of it
Because of the drive
because of the
stun?
drive stun.
And what did Mr. Slager say his condition was at the time?
He said that he was tired and he was winded and he could still hear a voice on the phone.
And what was he concerned about?
Someone coming to the scene, knowing where they were. He said that he didn't hear Officer Habersham check en route, but said that he works the same zone as him, and that's why he called him in particular, because he would get there the fastest and that he would be the closest to him.
Okay.
He's-
Now, what did he say happened after he had phoned or radioed in for 156 to step it up?
He said as he called on the radio, at that point, he was no longer holding Mr. Scott down. He had his taser in his right hand, and he used his left hand. Mr. Scott used his left hand and grabbed the butt end of the taser. He said that, Mr. Slager said that he tried to pull it away. He said he was pulling away with his right arm and pushing with his left. As he was pulling away, he had tension on, Mr. Scott had tension on the barrel, and he said he was able to get the taser.
And what did he say happened after Mr. Scott had gained possession of the taser?
He said that after Scott jerked the taser out of his hand, he was looking right at the taser, and Mr. Scott then maneuvered the taser in his hand to point it directly at Mr. Slager.
And what did Mr. Slager indicate he was doing?
He said that he tried to push away somehow on Mr. Scott's body, that his hands were somewhere on his body. He didn't know where, but he tried to push away, and that Mr. Scott rotated his body to the left towards him.
And what did he say that Mr. Scott was doing with the taser?
He said that he was continually coming forward and with the taser, and Mr. Slager said that he believed he was trying to hit him with the taser.
And what did you understand him to mean by hit him with the taser?
Trying to use it against him.
Okay. And what did he say his goal was?
To get away from the taser. He said he was scared, he was fatigued. He again cited his adrenaline, his thoughts of who was coming, whether or not he was going to go home to his pregnant wife. He said that if Mr. Scott tased him, he could take his weapon from him. He said he thought he would take his weapon and shoot him. He is all these things are going through his mind, and at that point, he got to his feet, and Mr. Scott got up on his feet. He said he was winded and tired and breathing heavy. He said that Mr. Scott had the taser pointed directly at him with his right hand, and he saw the barrel coming straight at him again. Some of this is repetitive.
Okay. And it's repetitive because why?
We just took it as he told us, and at
Okay.
times he would have to go back, and sometimes he would restate
Okay.
what he was going over.
And he said Mr. Scott was coming with the barrel straight at him, correct?
Correct?
With his arm extended out?
Yes, and he said, Mr. Slager said that he then went off to the left side and shuffle stepped to the left, like he had been trained to do. He pulled his gun and said that he fired. He said that Mr. Scott was turning as he was firing. He said that Mr. Scott then stumbled off to the grass and fell to the ground.
Okay. And were Mr. Miles and Officer Slager still demonstrating what had occurred at that point?
They were.
And how close were Mr. Miles and Mr. Slager to one another when he indicated he started shooting?
They were just right in front of each other.
And pretty much face to face?
Correct.
And that Mr. Scott turned?
Was starting to turn as he started to
and
shoot.
shot. Okay, if you would, continue on.
Mr. Slager said when he came off to the left, he stopped and said that Mr. Scott's arm was still up, and as he was going to the left, he was pulling his weapon and he fired. He said he stopped and he fired, and he said that he was moving and Mr. Scott was moving to his left and turning to his left. He said when he shuffled to the left, he just started firing.
And he said while he was firing, what did Mr. Scott do?
That Mr. Scott continued to turn and went into the grass and he fell on his face.
Okay.
He said that he was standing with a gun on him, and he, at that point, came over the radio and said 223 dispatch, shots fired, suspect subject down, and holstered his weapon. He was laying there face down. I saw a bunch of blood on his right side. I handcuffed him, didn't say anything. I felt for a pulse, and Habersham came. He said that he thought that he fired a total of 6 shots. And at that point, Mr. Ayler requested to take a break, citing that he thought that Mr. Slager was getting confused.
And after the break, what happened?
They came back into the room, and he resumed with basically where they were at. He said that he then said that at this point, Mr. Slager was up and Mr. Scott was up, and Mr. Slager had the taser in his right hand and was coming towards him. He said, I saw him coming towards me. He said, I took a step back, a side step to the left. I pulled my weapon and I fired. He said that as he was firing for 2 to 3 seconds, he didn't know what his exact position was.
Whose exact position was?
He said that he didn't know what Mr. Scott's exact position was. He said after that he didn't know what happened. He saw Mr. Scott stumbling into the grass and fall. He said if you're facing the back of the pawn shop, he fell to the grass on the left.
Between what?
Between the brick road and the fence.
And what did he say about the reason he believed he fired 6 shots?
He said the only reason he was saying 6 shots is because he looked at his gun, which was a Glock 21 .45 caliber, and when fully loaded, topped off, there were 14 rounds. And he said that he basically looked at it and...
And that he kept his gun topped off?
Correct.
And after he told you about that, what did he say he did with his weapon?
He said that he holstered his weapon and he went to handcuff Mr. Scott. He said that the taser was somewhere on the ground between where he was firing and Mr. Scott landed.
And that Mr. Scott must have what?
Dropped it somewhere.
And who did he say showed up at that time?
He said other officers came on scene. He grabbed the taser and holstered it because he didn't know if anyone was coming to help him. At that
Help
point,
him, meaning Mr. Scott, I'm assuming, correct?
I'm sorry?
Help him, I'm assuming he meant come to help Mr. Scott, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Anyway, and he said he thought that others were coming to help him. And what point, what happened when other officers arrived on the scene?
He said that he was taken away. He went to Sergeant Webb's patrol car, and then Lieutenant Bowman arrived. He said that he made mention that Sergeant Webb was on leave and he didn't know where he came from. He said that Officer Habersham was first on scene, Sergeant Gann was second on scene, and Webb was third, that he recalled. He said Sergeant Webb took possession of his weapon and gave him his weapon. He said he didn't say, Sergeant Webb didn't say why, but he thought that it was for evidence reasons. When Lieutenant Bowman got on scene, he corrected that and said no, and instructed Sergeant Webb to give Mr. Slager his weapon back.
Okay. And where was he taken?
He was taken to City Hall.
And